Taking the story of Adam and Eve literally creates tremendous scientific and cultural issues for society. However, reading it as a myth allows us to find new and meaningful interpretations that can be better applied to our lives. Now, many people will probably tell you that it's literally true, that Adam and Eve were the actual first humans on Earth. However, this perspective leaves one with little more than an odd story about a couple who talked with God, with a talking snake, and were immortal until they disobeyed God's command. But this story is much more than a simple, matter-of-fact explanation for how humans originated and why we are mortal. There's much beneath the surface of this story, and that is precisely the nature of myth. Now, a myth is not a lie or something that's false and holds no value. Myths are stories that reveal fundamental realities and insights about human nature as a particular society perceives them. A religious myth is usually designed to advance one tradition over others and to address questions that are relevant to a specific culture. The story of Adam and Eve is just such a myth. It's intended to be a myth, and by hollowing it out of its symbolic value, it loses its potency and ability to affect us on a deeper level. But in order to fully appreciate this story, we must first try to understand it from the perspective in which it was originally viewed, in its original language and context. The story begins in Genesis chapter 2, where it says, "All the wild shrubs did not yet exist on the earth, and all the wild plants had not yet sprouted. This was because God had not brought rain on the earth, and there was no man to work the ground." All of creation works as an organism in this story. Mankind is one with nature and cannot thrive without it, just as the earth receives nourishment from man's efforts. Then God formed man out of dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. Man thus became a living creature. The first human is made from the same ground he is meant to till, but is unique in that he has the breath of God within him, animating his person. In Hebrew, the word here for breath is neshama, which means breath, but also spirit. Hence, in Judaism, humans are living souls, possessing life because of God's divine breath. It's also worth noting that the word for earth is Adamah, the female form of Adam. Adamah drops the feminine letter He and becomes Adam, or a man. But is Adam a man in our sense of the word? Is Adam a male? As we have seen, Adam is derived from Adamah and is spelled Aleph, Dalet, Mem. This word appears elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, but does not always denote an individual who has male characteristics. For example, in Leviticus chapter 1, verse 2, Moses tells the Israelites how to make a proper sacrifice, saying, "When one of you brings a mammal as an offering to God, the sacrifice must be taken from the cattle, sheep, or goats." Looking at the Hebrew, we see the word translated as "one of you" is Adam. Again in Leviticus, chapter 24, verse 17 reads, "One who takes a human life must be put to death." In Hebrew, the word for human is Adam. And finally, in the book of Numbers, chapter 5, verse 6, it says, "If a man or woman sins against his fellow man, thus being untrue to God and becoming guilty of a crime, he must confess the sin that he has committed." The word for fellow man is Adam with a He prefix, while the word for man is Ish, and the word for woman is Isha. God did not create Ish from the dust of the ground. He created Adam. So wouldn't it be more accurate, as long as we're speaking English, to say Adam was not the first man, but the first human? We then read, "And the Lord God planted a garden in Eden in the east, and there he put Adam whom he had formed." The Hebrew term for garden implies hedged area. It's a secluded paradise, a womb-like environment, protected from outside forces. God made grow out of the ground every tree that is pleasant to look at and good to eat, including the tree of life in the middle of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Then in verse 17, God gave Adam a commandment, saying, "You may definitely eat from every tree of the garden, but from the tree of knowledge of good and evil do not eat, for on the day that you do eat from it, you will definitely die." The tree of life represents the fact that all life comes from God as a gift. The tree of knowledge of good and evil, which is forbidden to man, symbolizes the benevolent character of God's commands. God gives and sets limitations at the same time. In setting the tree of knowledge as a limit, he lets man know that he both gives and requires obedience. It is a benevolent act, wishing for humans to never know evil, for only God can conquer evil. However, as we know, mankind's loss of innocence is inevitable. God said, "It is not good for Adam to be alone. I will make a compatible helper for him." God had formed every wild beast and every bird of heaven out of the ground. He brought them to Adam to see what he would name each one. Whatever Adam called each living thing would remain its name. Adam named every livestock animal and bird of the sky, as well as all the wild beasts. In naming them, Adam realizes that they could be no real partner for him. Thus, for Adam, there was not found a helper as his partner. So God caused a deep sleep to fall upon him, and he slept. In the ancient world, sleep is a symbol for death. Therefore, Adam first must die in order for Eve to live. In most translations, you'll then read that God took one of Adam's ribs and closed up its place with flesh, and the rib that God had taken from Adam, he made into a woman and brought her to Adam. By today's standards, the idea that women are no more than the derivation of a man's rib is quite demeaning to women. But like how Adam does not exactly translate directly into man, the word we often translate as rib has its own unique meaning in Hebrew. The word so often translated as rib comes from the Hebrew word selah. In Genesis, we find selah conjugated as mitzalatov, referring to Adam, meaning one of his ribs. Or is it one of his sides? The difference between these two translations is tremendously important. Each of them has a hugely different consequence for who Eve is and the role she plays in the story. We can gain insight into what is meant by selah by looking at how it is used elsewhere. One example comes from Exodus chapter 25, verse 12. Here we find selo, a variant of selah, used twice in the same verse. In this verse, God instructs Moses in how to construct an ark. God tells Moses, "Cast 4 gold rings for the ark and place them on its 4 corners, 2 rings on one side and 2 on the other side. Both of the sides are even." A similar use of selah is found in Exodus chapter 27, verse 7, in reference to the proper way of building an altar. It says, "Place the poles in the rings so that the poles will be on the 2 sides of the altar when it is carried." Again, the sides are equal. So what should we make of the Genesis use of selah? It seems to be much more than a small fragment of Adam's anatomy from which Eve is created. The only way the definition of selah can remain consistent is if half of Adam is taken while he is asleep. Then, as verse 21 reads, God closed up its place with flesh, and the side that God had taken from Adam he made into a woman and brought her to Adam. Then Adam said, "Now this is bone from my bones and flesh from my flesh." He immediately recognizes her as being unique. Unlike the animals, she is not formed from the dust of the ground, but from Adam himself. Adam finally has a suitable companion. Also, up to this point, Adam had been androgynous. It is only when woman is introduced that he designates himself as male, as the rest of the verse reads. She shall be called woman, or Isha, because she was taken from man, or Ish. And then follows a passage in verse 24 that is often overlooked, reading, "A man shall therefore leave his father and mother, and be united with his wife, and they shall become one flesh." The man leaves his family to cling to his wife.